James 4 verse 2 tells us that we have not because we ask not. A lot of times people don't get their heart's desire because they go to other people before they go to God. But then verse 3 says, and even when we ask amiss, meaning that we are asking from our own motives, our own selfish desires, and not necessarily seeking or wanting to hear the heart of God on the matter. We don't want the will of God, we want our own will. So I was talking to a mentee earlier today. She signed up for the new program that starts in May, I think May 11th, shameless plug. And she was talking about a situation with her family that she's been praying about for years, and she's gotten no answer. And she said she was standing on Jeremiah 29:11. So this is where I came in and tried to add as much wisdom as I could to the situation. Because here it is that she's asking, but maybe what she's standing on is the reason why she has not received an answer yet. Or maybe she has, because sometimes we don't realize that God's silence or God's no response sometimes is a response, right? Sometimes it's him saying, I've already told you what to do. Sometimes it's him saying, get up and respond to faith. Sometimes it's him saying, no, not now, not yet. But whatever the situation, what I want us to talk about is that Jeremiah 29:11, because if we're going to handle scripture with integrity, we have to make sure that we handle it contextually first before sentimentally. In other words, we have to deal with the accuracy of scripture before we deal with the inspiration of scripture. And we're all guilty of this. I mean, I'm sure in many of my writings, I used to quote Jeremiah 29:11. I think I probably quoted it in 2 books, but this was before I got serious about actually studying scriptures and not just reading, not just merely glancing over scripture or using a devotional and then find one verse or, passage to read. I became very intentional, just as I am in business, to learn more and to do more. I decided not just to study, but actually to go back to school as well, Liberty University, to further my studies. So it was very important to me to grow in the Word, because the Bible tells us that we go from glory to glory, from newborns in the faith to maturing in our faith. There's no reason for us to be at the same place biblically that we were when we just came to know Christ, all right? Because we don't do that anywhere else. You don't do that on the job. You don't do that in your personal life. You don't do that anywhere. I mean, we grow and we mature. That's why many of us are years older than we were 5 years ago. That's why many of us have gray hairs, okay? All right, so let's look at this scripture, because as I mentioned, we want to make sure that we're not just sentimental, but we're contextually correct. So for those of you who don't know Jeremiah 29:11, I don't know if you've been living under a rock, but it says, for I know the plans that I have for you, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a future and a hope. So just like James 4 talk about, when we ask amiss. Usually when this scripture is quoted, it's quoted amiss. Because when someone talks about Jeremiah 29:11, I know the plans, they're usually talking about personal achievement. They're usually talking about success. They're usually talking about what God is about to do, or what they're expecting of him to do, even if they're not living the life that he expects them to live, right? But this scripture had nothing to do with personal achievement, absolutely nothing to do with business, our lives, or marriages, or anything like that. I know, right? Jeremiah is not speaking about or into a moment of personal elevation. He was actually speaking about national judgment. Can you believe it? The audience is not a single believer navigating personal purpose. The audience was actually the nation of Judah that was under Babylonian exile and captivity. The people were displaced, they were stripped of their autonomy. They were living under a foreign rule, right? So this has absolutely nothing to do with breakthrough. A breakthrough is coming. This was about discipline. So unless you are talking about discipline, this is not the scripture to stand on, okay? So God is saying to them, while you're there in captivity, build houses, marry, do all the things, because you're going to be there for a while. He wanted them to settle in Babylon. And if you read the scripture in full context, that should be concerning as a Westerner reading the scripture. God was not commanding deliverance as most of us want a quick fix, right? Or a quick breakthrough. He was saying, you better get comfortable in captivity, because if you look at verse 10, he says, this captivity is going to last for 70 years, 70. So this means most of the people who were hearing Jeremiah 29:11 did not live to see 11 come to pass. A lot of them would have probably died in captivity before these 70 years were up. So if we're going to borrow that scripture to use, God is not speaking to individual timelines or personal goals or ambitions. He was speaking to his covenant people about the timeline of their deliverance, which extended beyond their immediate experience. So therefore, this is corporate, not individual. This is generational, not immediate. This is covenant, not motivational. Paul the Apostle was quite similar in his message in the New Testament, where he did not focus on the individual's comfort, but he spoke a lot about the suffering that believers have to do for the advancement of the gospel. So Jeremiah 29:11 was not offering an escape. He was offering God's sovereignty through discipline or indiscipline. Now, as we know from the Western, which is us, we often read scriptures from the lens of individualism and consumerism. The text usually becomes about me, my success, my future, my outcome, me and my 3 friends, my family, and my dog, and my cat. But biblical text is written within a collective covenantal framework. Identity was tied to the people of God and not personal journeys. So even when personal stories are relayed, it was always supposed to be tied back to God's covenant and the people that he has a covenant with. So usually when we read scriptures, we read it from a personal entitlement rather than a covenantal alignment with God. We usually remove it from exile and place it in ambition. We've moved it from discipline and have placed it in desire. We have removed the context of what Jeremiah is saying from God's timeline to our own timeline. That is not proper exegesis, my friend. That is imposition. And when we add to it or read into it what it doesn't say, that is eisegeting. Now the question becomes, is this passage for the church today? The answer requires precision. The direct promise in its original form was given to Israel in exile. So we cannot lift that promise wholesale and apply it to an individual believer as a guarantee to get out of trouble. However, the theological principle embedded in the scripture is still valid. God is sovereign, even in seasons of disruption. Our seasons are often disrupted with hardship. It's a part of life. But God's redemptive response and answer happens on his timeline, not ours. So let's not use Jeremiah 29:11 prematurely. Let's not personalize what God never intended for us to personalize. And let's extract the real principle. This is about discipline. This is not about some quick miracle or quick answer to what we're looking for or praying about. So though this is very unpopular and might be contrary to some, in this 21st century, as a Western believer, we must still apply the true counsel of Scripture. Read Scripture in full context, because Scriptures are not meant to be appealing. They're meant to be accurate. And when it is handled carefully, it does not always speak to comfort. It corrects, confronts, and realigns. And maybe, my friend, that is why what you're believing for or standing on has not happened yet, because you're not believing from the right context. I hope this helps somebody.